Hey, everybody. My name is Ellen Lapson. I'm the director of the Center for Security Policy Studies at the Schar School of George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia. I'm delighted to welcome you to this co-hosted program featuring a brand new monograph by Raymond Kuo on China's gray zones, contests of initiative. And we're really delighted to be partnering with the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. You'll hear from them momentarily. But I just wanted to say a few words about our center. We are an academic center within the School of Policy and Government that promotes a lot of collaboration among students and faculty on both practical skills like crisis simulations and visits to national security enterprises and institutions. But we're also very proud to be hosting a monograph series called International Security Challenges. We've done 3 since we launched this series a couple of years ago. And today we're featuring a brand new monograph on China's gray zone, and it complements perfectly the second in our series called A Question of Time. And the author of the Question of Time on Taiwan's defense and deterrence strategy is with us today as a discussant. So Professor Mike Hunsaker will be joining the program to comment and engage with Raymond about his book. So we have a China and a Taiwan piece, and I don't think anybody would dispute that that is going to be one of the premier security challenges of as we move in further along in the 21st century. I want to let people know that Raymond's monograph is available through Westphalia Press. That is now our publishing partner, and you can get it on Kindle or in a paperback version. So we're really delighted to hear Raymond present on his new study and to hear a wonderful discussion with Professor Mike Hunsaker and Mary Curtin. So Professor Mary Curtin is at the Humphrey School, and I'm delighted to partner with you. The connection is that Raymond lives in Minnesota, so we turn to our friends at the Humphrey School to join us today. And Mary, over to you for another word of welcome.
Thank you, Ellen, for that introduction. And as Ellen said, I'm Mary Curtin. I'm the diplomat in residence at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Raymond Kuo is Minnesotan and teaches in the political science department at the University of Minnesota. And we're really happy to be able to partner with the Schar School today on this really timely event. While Dr. Kuo's book was published before the start of this new administration, we have started to see the signals of where this administration might take China and East Asia policy. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today. As Ellen suggested, Dr. Kuo is a PhD in political science from Princeton University. In addition to his academic work and publishing this most recent book on China, he has also worked at the United Nations, at the National Democratic Institute, and with the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, among others. We are very lucky to have him here. We're hopeful that when we are back to in-person events, we can continue to have these kind of conversations. But without further ado, and on behalf of our Dean, Laura Bloomberg, and our Associate Dean, Catherine Squires, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kuo and welcome you all to this event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Mary, both so very much. Thank you all for coming to my talk today on my first book, Contest of Initiative. It's good to see some familiar names in the chat, the participant list as well. So I'm going to start off our discussion by just giving about 10 minutes of remarks outlining the book. First, starting off with what's the problem, which is since at least 2010, China has been engaged in a militarized assertion of sovereignty over most of the South and East China Sea. Then I'll talk about what China's strategy is, what elements drive that strategy, and what we in the US can do about it. So the problem, as I said, since at least 2010, China has been engaged in a militarized assertion of sovereignty over most of the 2 waterways, the South China Sea and the East China Sea, based on this sort of legally dubious claim of historic rights. And in order to support this assertion, it's engaged in most notably island building, dredging up about 3,200 acres since 2013, in creating about 27 outposts on a whole variety of different islands in these two waterways. Many of these have military bases with anti-aircraft and anti-ship capabilities, as well as airfields to support fighters and I think to some extent bombers as well. Now, the goal of this assertion is to establish compliance with Chinese maritime rules and also normalize Chinese control and sovereignty. Now, the stakes, there are some economic ones. For example, if you control the South China Sea, you control the Straits of Malacca, through which about a third of all trade goods in every year flows through. Also, the South China Sea itself has about 3,500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and about 23 billion barrels of oil. Now, for any individual state, that's a bonanza, but it's actually a fairly small proportion of our global reserves of those two types of energy. Really, what's driving this is nationalism and the lack of a legitimate security settlement post-World War II. The maritime zones just haven't been really settled, and now that China has the ability, or the newfound ability to assert its sovereignty, it's doing so. So how does China execute this strategy? In the book, I call it a gray zone strategy. It's the use of sub-conventional forces to seize control, backed by the threat of military escalation. So you've got two forces working in tandem here. You've got the sub-conventional forces, the Chinese Coast Guard, the Maritime Militia. They're nominally civilian, but the vessels can be large, equipped with like small arms or water cannons, and some of them have reinforced hulls because a favorite tactic is to just ram other ships and knock them out of the way. You also have the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force, which, barring the United States, are the largest and probably preeminent military forces in the region. And so this gray zone strategy is executed in kind of three steps. First, China will seize upon a small change to the status quo. For example, the Philippines resupplying one of their outposts, or they will kind of generate a small dispute. Then, when the other country responds, they'll flood the zone with sub-conventional forces that exhaust and drive away these other countries' vessels. And then finally, once those vessels are out of the area, then they'll maintain control through island building, presence missions, and sort of continued patrols. And the reason that China can do this is because it enjoys what we call escalation dominance. Any individual navies, destroyers in that region have the capability to blast the Chinese Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia out of the water. These are still civilian ships, and they just don't have the firepower. But were, say, the Philippines or Japan to do so, immediately the Chinese Navy and Air Force would be engaged. And because China has superior conventional forces, regional states don't want to escalate to that level, so they keep at the sub-conventional level. But because China also has superior sub-conventional forces, this leaves regional states with few options. They can resist for a while, but then they'll eventually have to be exhausted, or they'll have to retreat from in the face of these Chinese forces, let alone try and dislodge Chinese control from any territory that's seized. And so that's why in the book I call this gray zone strategy contests of initiative. Those countries who can seize, maintain, and extend the pace of operations, you're going to win because you force the other side to react to your moves, and you leave them with few political or military options. So what elements drive this strategy? And in the book, I use a statistical analysis to say that it comes down to two things. First, challenger, in this case China, the challenger's capabilities. They have to have escalation dominance, they have to have superior conventional and sub-conventional forces. But even more important is defender cohesion, because challengers are picking on isolated states, coercing over issues that are not directly covered within, say, alliance agreements. It's important for defending states to close those gaps through political and military agreement and coordination. And so in the book, in the case analysis, I find that whenever the US extends its military guarantees, China backs off or levels off its aggression. In the case of Japan, the US reaffirmed the US-Japan alliance 3 times, that it covers these disputed territories. And you see a consistent drop in Chinese incursions every time. With the Philippines, the Marine General vaguely reaffirmed the US-Philippine alliance, and then China withdrew some of its vessels as a confidence-building measure. And lastly, with Vietnam, not a US ally, fought a war with them 50 years ago. Yet at the same time, the US supports Vietnam's retaliatory measures against the Chinese, and the Chinese with deploy their vessels further away, they reduced the size of their declared sovereignty zone, and they ultimately packed up operations about a month before they were planning to. And so you might think, great, all that we really have to do for this gray zone challenge is just say that the US will extend its commitments to whatever is being contested over. But it's unfortunately not that simple. Because as I said, political cohesion is the key variable here. And unfortunately, it's not just that Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia that have territorial disputes with China. They also have territorial disputes with each other. And unless the US can lead and close these political gaps, you're still going to get these sort of gray zone challenges by Beijing. So lastly, what can we do about this? The book provides 3 different courses of action that the US can take. I'm going to focus on one in today's discussion. My preferred one, which is called extended deterrence. It has 3 elements that accumulate upon each other. So the first one is a political settlement of territorial disputes. If the US is able to roll back Chinese power, you don't want, Japan and then Vietnam suddenly vying for their own, trying to create their own outposts in an effort to catch up. You want the US to engage and settle these disputes politically. If they join this political settlement, then the states are eligible to join a standing security organization that coordinates US and partner responses to future maritime violations. And if they join that organization, then it unlocks allied military assistance and combined arms programs. So you have a cumulative settlement here, a political one that unlocks security and foreign policy coordination that then unlocks military cooperation to defend that settlement. And the reason you want to do this is because China views this maritime assertion as a regional strategy, whereas the US tends to view it as a bilateral one. A Chinese challenge to Japan is a matter for the US-Japan alliance. A Chinese challenge to the Philippines is a matter for the US-Philippine alliance. It's not connected necessarily to an overall strategy or overarching strategy. And so as a result, extended deterrence, what it does is it matches or aligns the strategy to the regional scope of the challenge. Now, extended deterrence will increase the risk of US-China confrontation, but in order to prevail against these kinds of gray zone challenges, you have to close these political gaps. And that's what the strategy does. So thank you all for coming today. I'm looking forward to the discussions and for your questions.
So Raymond, thanks for the presentation. It's great to see you again. By the way, word of apology in advance. I'm calling in from Texas. We're having a little bit of a windstorm, so if it sounds like I have tornadoes raging in the background, although I'm a bit skittish from the winter storm a few weeks ago, I assure you I'll be able to hang out at least for the rest of this seminar. So let me start just by heaping some shameless praise on the project and the monograph, which I just reread again yesterday and still loved it as much the second time as the first time. There are a few things in particular I really like, and I really encourage those of you who are otherwise interested or curious to go and take a look at this project. First, Raymond does, I think, a terrific job of offering us a theoretically grounded overview of Chinese gray zone activity, particularly since 2010. And personally, as an instructor who teaches in the security space, I think it's going to be a fabulous introduction to the topic. I'm certainly going to use in my classes, and I would encourage other instructors to consider the same. Second, I think Raymond's work does an excellent job of clarifying and defining what the gray zone is and what gray zone provocations are useful for, which by extension helps us understand what the gray zone is not and what gray zone tools are not useful for, which is something that to be perfectly honest, I think has been noticeably absent in a lot of the policy discussions that tend to treat this as this kind of boogeyman amorphous threat that we can't possibly get our arms around. Third, just like Raymond highlighted at the end of his presentation, does an excellent job of offering kind of 3 basic policy options the United States can consider, and almost as important, helping us to understand that there are going to be trade-offs and opportunity costs depending which way you go. And Raymond clearly has his preferences, but I think does a good job for policymakers of saying, yeah, but these are the other options you can consider. Which leads to the 4th thing I like the most, and this comes straight from my scholarly background, which is this, I think, crucially important insight that short of accommodation, which I think is not going to be politically palatable pretty much anywhere, it offers this very paradoxical finding, which is that the best way to combat this flexible amorphous threat is through rigidity, right? In other words, the United States is going to have to engage in a flurry of institution building, tying hands, clear signaling, and aligning with allies in a way that, again, it seems almost counterintuitive when you're dealing with something that is purely flexible, but I think it has an almost Schelling-like logic to it. So with that, Raymond, I'd like to kick things off by asking a question. I just heaped a bunch of praise at your very rigorous, focused look at the gray zone, but I'd like to take a step back from the gray zone. You did a great point of suggesting the United States has a tendency of looking myopically at these challenges. And some scholars look very myopically at the gray zone challenge, but China has a lot of tools in its toolkit that it can use. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how much of a threat the gray zone and gray zone provocations are, especially relative to the other things China could be doing. You make a tremendous case that gray zone provocations are China's most likely course of action, especially in the South and East China Seas. But does that mean it represents the most dangerous course of action? Can China achieve its most ambitious objectives through the gray zone? Can it kind of kill off some of our individual partners with death by 1,000 cuts? Or is there a risk that by focusing on the gray zone, the United States is actually going to leave vulnerable itself and its allies and partners to more risky strategies China could implement? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question and also for the praise as well. So it's a good question. I think, the advantage of the gray zone is that it operates in this sort of liminal space between very, very clear, existential threats and maybe sort of things we might think of like economic or political coercion. It is militarized, or it uses force of some kind, but not in a way that we usually expect in conventional military warfare. And so I think there are a couple risks here. I mean, the one good caveat is because it doesn't use conventional warfare or conventional forces explicitly, we're not getting directly into those sorts of vital national security interests, or at least we have the perception that it's not these vital national security interests that are being threatened. And so maybe it's easier, at least for the United States, to take a step back. However, I think there is a risk of miscalculation. Vietnam was perhaps most aggressive of all the countries that I studied for this monograph of trying to challenge the Chinese. They engaged in a lot of ramming themselves. And it's, you can very easily think like, well, if let's say the rammings happen and a couple ships sink or a couple people die, then you can very easily see how this can escalate out of control and then become a sort of existential threat or something that both sides can't back out of. I also think that there's a miscalculation. There's also the danger of exhaustion. The Japanese, which had one of the most advanced navies in the region, were having trouble keeping up and monitoring just the sheer number of Chinese vessels that were there. If you bring in the United States, it might be able to help with, kind of offload some of this burden. But for any individual country, they're already being stretched thin. I think within the last 2 months, China has kind of violated the median line between China and Taiwan. And that's already kind of eroding Taiwanese readiness to, push back against any sort of Chinese incursion. Yeah, it always seems like they're posturing until they're not. And so there's this danger of miscalculations, this danger of like kind of unexpected or uncoordinated action that, if you're Taiwan or Malaysia or even Japan, that you might find yourself in a kind of a sticky situation without having coordinated with the United States and kind of left out to dry to some extent, which is, I think, again, endemic, a characteristic of the gray zone, that they're specifically targeting those issues that push a political dilemma onto the allies.
Thank you both for those really interesting perspectives. And I would like to maybe broaden this out even a bit more. As I mentioned in the introduction, we are just now beginning to see signals, and I think they are only signals right now, of what this new administration might do with regard to policy across Asia, but in particular US-China relations, and then US relations with other friends and allies. We just saw that Secretary Blinken has announced that he will have his first in-person meetings with counterparts visiting Japan and South Korea next week, and on the way back with his Chinese counterpart. And I noticed in both of those that the Secretary of State in the meetings with South Korea and Japan will be accompanied by the Secretary of Defense. And so this raises the question of both how does the United States, so the policies that you are recommending are vis-a-vis what we've seen as China's gray zone strategy, that is a soft or a military sort of projection outward, and you recommend responses that are similar to that. But not only the United States has very complicated and complex relationship with China. And if you read the new sort of guidance on the national security strategy, it doesn't really break any new ground in terms of talking about US-China policy, but it includes the whole array of issues, not only that sort of security engagement or contention, but also the interests that we have economically, ranging from, here in the Midwest, agricultural exports, intellectual property protection, but also that we need China to work with us at the UN and other places. And we're not the only ones. So in addition to this sort of ramming and all these other things that happen with Southeast Asian countries, China at the same time has Belt and Road Initiative projects, right, with Vietnam. And so your strategy focuses on that gray zone problem, but maybe you could describe for our listeners a little bit how you see that fitting into the broader context of this really complex relationship between the United States and China.
Sure thing. So I think one challenge or maybe one deficiency of the Trump administration's policy towards Asia was its unilateral nature. And I think as Mike points out, my preferred policy is one of institution building and to some extent rigidity. And that's for a reason. It's because, actually my second book that's coming out this summer, I talk about the disadvantages of having a more flexible realpolitik approach to foreign policy is that nobody can trust you. Sure, if you are kind of the pariah state, this is actually helpful. But if you're the hegemon or the leading state like the United States is, those relationships are the core of your power. And so I think Blinken going to talk with our main Asian allies first to coordinate with them and reassure them, and then going to the Chinese is exactly the right order that this should be done in. Oftentimes, I think with, Trump, and he, in order to advance the U.S.-North Korean dialogue, he suddenly canceled war games with South Korea without consultation, and that just kind of threw everyone into like disarray. So this idea of working with your allies first, getting everybody on the same page, and then moving together as a united front against your potential adversary, I think is exactly the right call. And I think it's a right call, not just in terms of a competitive or even a combative strategy, but also in terms of getting Chinese cooperation. One of the key difficulties, I think, is that any sort of initiative that the United States produces on its own, China can kind of undercut it because it's so integrated into the economic and political systems. It can undercut it by making side agreements with even some of our allies. But if the U.S. can foreclose those options in the same way that it forecloses the kind of political gaps in the gray zone, then China has much less room to maneuver. There's a tension here, right? It's hard to cooperate with somebody you're kind of punching below the belt at the same time. But we were able to do that with the USSR. And I think in part that's, through skillful diplomacy of working with your allies first, getting that solidified, kind of closing off those gaps, and then advancing forward, which is something that the Trump administration's unilateralism wasn't able to accomplish. I think, Biden is kind of an institution builder who believes in international institutions, so that's going to be helpful. The trick is, I think, though, that regional states might be concerned that this gives China an opportunity to undercut their position vis-a-vis the United States. And so it's going to take that skillful diplomacy by Blinken, by Biden, and others to demonstrate, like, no, we are on your side. We want us all together as a group working on a coherent strategy.
So if I could build on this apt observation about China's ability to drive wedges with our partners and allies in the region, and return back to your, again, I think very apt point about the need to engage in some institution building, particularly in the security space in the region. That's obviously, I think, going to be, it's something that the Washington, D.C. policy community is going to be very receptive to right now. The Quad, these other kind of ad hoc coalitions are a very hot topic. But it does strike me that one of the things gray zone strategies are particularly good at is exploiting these kind of stag hunt-like problems, where we all agree that at the end of the day, if we could somehow get to this great outcome, it would be good for everybody. But making our way there is really subject to these challenges, and that gray zone stratagems can allow China to one by one kind of pick off and pit actors against one another. So I would just like to hear your thoughts about what you think the prospects are for engaging in this very serious act of institution building, especially given that gray zone stratagems can be kind of the perfect antidote from China's perspective for kind of inoculating itself against that risk.
Sure, absolutely. I forget if it was John Mearsheimer or somebody wrote in like the pages of foreign policy that, you know, the last 4 years in US foreign policy towards Asia have been a disaster. The fortunate thing is that the last 4 years of Chinese policy towards Asia have also been a disaster. So you've got this kind of race to the bottom here, which is helpful for the United States since we're further away. You know, insofar as, you know, Chinese maritime and I guess military or security policy is causing a backlash in Asia, that's actually really, really useful for the United States. They can, you know, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia can all feel more comfortable because we're just not that close. The trick, of course, is because we're not that close, we may not have that much interest in being, you know, being committed there. And so I think, you know, you can talk. The United States can engage in deep, extensive diplomacy, and I think it should. Yet at the same time, there's almost an institution is almost kind of a sine qua non. Like you're not going to get anything better than that for demonstrating your ability to engage. And ultimately, I think this is a political question. You know, there's a lot of momentum in the region towards closer security ties with the United States. And I also think that means there's a lot of advantage the United States can draw out to create a political settlement, also, you know, create better trade relations, or wider security discussions. It's just a question of whether or not the United States wants to do it. And I don't think there's any other country that can do it. You can't have Japan or even India or something like that. They're not going to be able to step in the breach. It's going to require American military muscle, political influence, and economic influence to fundamentally get this done. Whether whether the Biden administration is really up for this, I don't know. I would think so. Looking at the people they have, certainly in DOD and to some extent in the Department of State. I mean, Mira Rapp-Hooper is, I think, leading the policy planning division at Department of State, and she just came out with this new book on the need for system management and regime management as fundamental to American prosperity and American influence on the globe. And I think if people like that are in the driver's seat, it seems like, yes, they're much more inclined towards a sort of institution building or taking some of the existing institutions and converting them into something that will actually have teeth.
Mary, if you have one last question, and then I'll turn to the audience questions.
Great, thank you. You know, one of the question that that's sort of complementary to what I asked before. You've touched on this sort of on and off. I talked about how I thought this needed to fit into the US larger goals. How do you see China's specific strategies, the gray zone strategies, which are very confrontational, fitting into their other external major strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative, of building this sort of infrastructure diplomacy? How does China see those two fitting together?
Great question. So I tend to think, to some extent, Belt and Road and these sort of maritime assertions are targeting two different types of states. That Belt and Road is really about outside the immediate neighborhood of China. I know, like, it's heavily invested in, say, Sri Lanka and but further afield. But the maritime conflicts are primarily with like countries right on what they call the first island chain. So we're talking Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines to some extent, and Vietnam and Malaysia. Now, those first three are not going to be recipients of the Belt and Road, so you kind of knock those guys out. I think for the last three, there's this kind of skillful use of carrots and sticks. I'm reminded of Tom Christensen, one of my old professors, who said that diplomacy is fundamentally about reassurance on the one side and punishment on the other, and the kind of careful balance between the two. And so I do tend to see that for this relatively small set of states, the BRI and gray zone are kind of the carrot carrot and stick of that sort of diplomatic initiative. You know, you can think about the Philippines, for example. The Chinese really pushed against the Philippines a lot over the Scarborough Shoal and a couple other maritime zones as well. And yet, in 2013, the Philippines submitted the dispute to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas Arbitral Tribunal. And in 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal kind of returned its verdict and said that, no, the sort of historic rights claims that China has just are not legally binding whatsoever. They have no legal, they're just legal fiction. But in that intervening 3 years, China was able to use economic carrots to kind of hive off the Philippines from its support for its own lawsuit. They will say, here's a couple $2 billion in investment, maybe some corruption alongside it, to get the new president of the Philippines, Duterte, to say, we're just not going to, whatever the arbitral tribunal comes back with, we're just going to drop the issue. I think the problem here is that maybe China overplayed its hand in that several million or $1 billion of investment never really materialized. It's had a really hard time. The Philippines has had a really hard time getting China to stick to whatever agreement it's made. And part of the reason why it was so hard is because it was made in secret. And so as a result, other states are going to look at this and be a lot more cautious. Certainly the Vietnamese, maybe the Malaysians, but I tend to see these Belt and Road and Gray Zone as kind of first targeting two different types of states, and then for those states where they do overlap, serving this carrot and stick function. But again, going back to the kind of the disastrous Chinese foreign policy towards Asia, they may have overplayed their hand in terms of the Philippines, such that Vietnam and Malaysia are not going to be interested in this kind of thing going forward.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so really a very interesting exchange. You guys covered a lot of ground, but I can just warn you that our audience is going to pose even more provocative questions to you. So we have some really very serious substantive questions. So Joe Ross asks, Japan has announced that their air self-defense forces will not respond to every ADIZ border incursion from China. So Joe is asking, is there a difference in acceptance of risk between the maritime and air domains? So mostly we've talked about scenarios where ships are ramming each other. How do you relate to other domains of military interaction? Unmute.
Thank you. Our new Zoom lifestyle. So I think it's a great question. I think it makes a lot of sense for for Japan, not to respond to every ADIZ incursion, at least in terms of air power. China just has many more planes, and the Japanese can scramble their planes fairly quickly, so you have a little more time to wait. I actually would put a difference between maritime and air domains, just because air domains can't capture territory, or they can't assert power and compliance in the same way. Also, if one goal of the gray zone strategy is to control maritime shipping, well, the surface vessels are going to be far more important than anything in the air, just in terms of shipping, that kind of thing. I think the one area where where the maritime and air domains actually should be treated the same is over Taiwan. Because in the case of Japan, or say South Korea, even say Vietnam, there's not really a risk of a direct military conflict. That air power would be the first go-to thing. But there is a risk in the case of Taiwan. And so I think this is a problem for Taiwan, that their resources are more limited than Japan, and yet they're going to be stretched even further by this Chinese assertion.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have two questions that get to the supply chain issue of whether if the U.S. is engaged in heavy global supply chain restructuring, restricting technology flows to China, R&D investments domestically. How do you have any thoughts on how to mitigate supply chain issues that for the most part impede the development of alliance relationships? So where does the sort of military dimension of this crowded maritime space connect with the global economy and supply chain interventions that I think the United States is now quite focused on, as the Biden administration decides how much of the Trump era tariffs to dismantle? You know, what are the signals we want to send to China? Should we still be worried about supply chain challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an excellent question. A little bit outside my field of expertise, but it's absolutely something that needs to be discussed. I think if we can make a comparison with the Trump administration, when they're imposing tariffs on China, the first thing they did before they did that was impose tariffs on the EU, which is like not the best way to make effective tariff policy, because essentially what that means is if the US is imposing tariffs on the EU and on China, then China just has to sell to the EU instead of us. You get sort of trade diversion. What I think you want to do here, and what I think has already been happening just because of COVID, is sort of a closening or like kind of a reducing of the length of the supply chains, just because I think COVID has exposed just how vulnerable our supply chains are to a kind of massive shocks. And that also has implications for smaller shocks, but that still may affect maybe not the globe, but certainly the region or a significant chunk of the globe. And so as a result, we're already seeing this sort of shortening of supply chains, especially for medical supplies and technology. But I imagine also that I think of COVID as kind of an accelerant for some of the economic decoupling that we see between China and the United States. There are certainly financial costs to that. I think free trade saves the average American about $800 a year in terms of just lower prices. So, it is a policy question how much of that you want to give up in order to have a more effective containment policy of China, say. But the complement that absolutely has to happen is that the U.S. also has to work with its allies in order to create, not necessarily picking winners or losers, but creating more open, more innovative environments where that innovation, that technological development can actually happen. And so this would include things like coordinating with the EU, Japan on common standards over the internet, for example. The internet being almost like a public utility, a bundle of tubes that will, and also coordinating on things like privacy policy that will allow synergies across different systems, and as a result of that, greater innovation and development. It's still an open question whether or not that's, even if the US and EU and Japan were able to do that, it's going to offset the costs or lead to better innovation than you see in China, but it's the first step that you have to take.
So I'm going to extrapolate from some questions from friends of yours, Raymond, in the chat box, and ask both you and Mike to comment on the following question. We know that inside the US government at the classified level, there's all kinds of, contingency planning for kind of a range of scenarios. But you sitting in the scholarly and non-government world, how would you rank or rate the likelihood that there will be a China-Taiwan confrontation? I think the questioner asked for maybe over the next 6 years. So, in this decade, how worried are you that this is going to reach a point of no return? If Raymond, if you agree that Taiwan, even more than all the other cases, has a kind of high salience value for the Chinese. So I also, Mike, since Mike thinks about how well is Taiwan preparing to deter China, a more confident China, I think Mike should jump in on this question as well.
Mike, why don't you go first?
So it's a terrific question. A few things is one, yes, in academia, and I read both the questions in the chat box. In academia, we don't have access to top secret information. And so from time to time, we're going to say things that people who are inside the circle of trust will chuckle at because we didn't know. But that's the nature of the beast. And the wonderful thing about being in a transparent liberal democracy is we can have these debates and discussions. And these can be quite useful for signaling purposes for policymakers. The second thing I would say is I am definitely not in the business of prediction. I just wouldn't do it, especially because I don't have access to this sort of information. I would simply say, I believe that the risk of the Chinese deciding to use force against Taiwan is unacceptably higher than I would rather it would be. So I'm not going to put a pinpoint prediction in 5 years or 10 years, but I am not comfortable with the foundations on which deterrents have been built. Which comes to my third point. In conversations that I have had with those who are in the know, but of course they've not given me any of in the know, I have noticed a tendency to always remind me that there are things you don't know. And I always remind them that's wonderful, except since we are in the position of being the status quo actor trying to maintain the status quo, in general, what we gain by hiding capabilities and war plans, we are probably losing by not signaling those capabilities and war plans. And yes, we might have that perfect combination of plans that will just hand it to China if they attack, but wouldn't it be better for everybody if China didn't attack in the first place? Which is to say, if there are these wonderful, amazing secret plans, we may want to be leaking a little bit more of this rather than just, special operations forces posting on Facebook that they're training in Taiwan. Something a little bit clearer. And again, getting back to Raymond's point, that sometimes the best way to deal with flexibility is to tie your own hands with some level and degree of rigidity. And that, let's not run afoul of the Dr. Strangelove principle of deterrence and, not tell them we have this doomsday machine.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Strangelove, it's great. So Dan, good to see you again as well. So I would say, piggybacking on Mike's comments, and kind of, I think your kind of sub-question here, do you think we should remove some of the ambiguity in U.S.-China relations? So, full disclosure, I used to work for the Taiwanese, what is now the leading political party in Taiwan. So obviously anything I say should be taken with a really large grain of salt. But I think that the main issue is that Timothy Crawford wrote a great book in 2008 on pivotal deterrence, how the United States swings between an ally and an adversary to deter conflict from both sides, and it forms kind of a theoretical core of the of the book, my book, and I think is really, really helpful for understanding what's going on right now in U.S.-Taiwan-China relations. Whereas beforehand, the U.S. was a preponderant power; it could, its force was decisive in on whether either side won or lost any kind of conflict. Right now, it's less so. I think the RAND Corporation released a study about 3 or 4 years ago saying that China is able to in sort of 9 critical domains, China is going to be able to create parity in at least 4 of them, if not 5, which really, really complicates any sort of military defense of Taiwan's kind of scenario. At the same time, I think Taiwan has also become much more of a status quo actor. When, the switching of diplomatic recognition to China from the United States from Taiwan to China, the Taiwan Relations Act, at the time, Taiwan was under martial law, kind of personalistic dictatorship, much more volatile foreign policy. Now it's become much more of a status quo actor. It wants to join a lot of these international institutions and act as a responsible state within the international system. So I think the danger of Taiwan provoking a conflict with China is actually much reduced as well. And so if both of those kind of pillars of this pivotal deterrence strategy are eroding, then the U.S. faces far fewer downsides to kind of swinging its weight more firmly behind Taiwan than it has in the past. Robert Blackwell, I think Philip Zelikow, they released some kind of CFR strategy was a month back or something like that, which, posited a bunch of really interesting problems for the, sorry, my cat's sitting on my microphone, and posited a bunch of really interesting problems for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and sort of defense of Taiwan scenarios. But one issue that they didn't want to, what kind of line they didn't want to cross, was creating a more unambiguous posture in favor of defending Taiwan. And I think that was a real mistake, because they ultimately just ended up not analyzing the dynamics of sort of strategic ambiguity and how that's changed over time. So if you ask me personally, take it again with a huge grain of salt. I think, yes, I agree. I think that the U.S. should be reducing the ambiguity in its relationship with Taiwan.
Thanks. So we have an interesting question from Hamza Jamal that a little bit steps back, not just from Taiwan, but from the range of cases that you mentioned. So US maintains defense pacts with South Korea and Japan, but security cooperation is a sliding scale with the other countries in the region. And I wonder if he wonders whether you think leveraging allies with mutual defense pacts is more credible than those without defense treaties. How much does the formality of treaties matter? Even because there are cases where we have more contingent security cooperation agreements.
Oh, it's like you read my next book. Thank you, Hamza, for the question. It's okay, Jinx. So it is directly related to my second book, which is that I find that, you might think that with, the world is a dangerous place. So you're going to want to carefully tailor your alliances, like very specific threats, capabilities, vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. And so you should see like a wide diversity of really tailored, specialized alliances, which is entirely not what we see at all. If you pick any random two alliances, there's like a 75% chance that they're going to be identical to each other. And the reason why is because the form of security cooperation actually really, really matters. So another way of putting it is that, like, how do we know that something's credible? It's not just that someone pays a costly signal, right? You could be paying a whole bunch of money, but the other side doesn't think that's actually valuable. Then they're going to discount whatever amount of money you send to them. Instead, we as just human beings often use social standards to say, well, because the top group or the kind of the core clique of the international system, because they do this sort of thing, that must be the standard of effective international cooperation. I kind of call this like the mean girls theory of international politics, because they're the core group. It doesn't matter what they do. That's the cool thing to do. So you got to do it too. And so as a result, Hamza, when you're asking like South Korea and Japan on the one hand, whereas Taiwan or maybe Vietnam, the more informal kind of security cooperation, the Taiwanese and the Vietnamese are always going to be asking, how much does the US actually care about me? Yes, I'm getting money. Yes, I'm getting arms. But they're not giving me the same sort of guarantee that they're giving the South Koreans and the Japanese. Doesn't that mean that at some point they're going to sell me out? And there was this concern in the Trump administration when Trump took that phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, and a lot of some Asia watchers, some Taiwanese were like, "This is a great thing. Like we're actually getting the kind of diplomatic recognition and respect that Taiwan deserves." I had a different kind of take, and I was like, "This is because." That administration was not a consistent actor across and didn't follow sort of consistent principles or policies. It wanted to be the sort of fluid, almost Kissinger-like realpolitik foreign policy. Because it was kind of taking that tack, doesn't that mean that the administration will sell out Taiwan to the highest bidder or when it gets a better offer? And it turns out Josh Rogan, I think, is releasing a book very soon that says, yeah, that's exactly what happened. Like a month later, Trump met with Xi and they came to a couple personal agreements where when another person in the administration said, hey, what are we going to do about Taiwan? And Trump replies with, Taiwan is 2 effing feet away from China. If China wants to do anything, there's nothing we can do about it. I'm like, well, that's the issue. It's being sold, kind of thrown under the bus for this closer relationship that, that the US wanted to have at the time with China. And it's this kind of, unless you kind of abide by these social standards of what counts as credibility, you're always going to leave what I call this relative reliability concern. Not just how much how much do you care about me, but how much do you care about me vis-a-vis other people or other states. And unless you get that sort of symmetry, you're always going to have that problem.
So let me jump in here because I just heard a talk from the Secretary General of NATO. And so this conversation also happens within NATO circles of how do we revalidate the alliance when we're not quite sure where the Americans are heading and how much they still care about these. But remember that the core alliances after World War II were mutually obligatory, defense rules that you're supposed to come to the defense of the other actor. Whereas I think smaller countries around the world see these security cooperation agreements as more one-way streets, that we're receiving some services because the United States is the great security provider, if you will. So it's not that same level of mutuality. But let's just factor in American politics right now. Is it conceivable that the Senate would approve new treaties that are binding on the United States? I mean, I think as we move in the direction of, that as the restraint school, if you will, gains a little traction, and Biden himself, I think over his career has become more cautious about American entanglements and commitments, and there's a general assumption that the US public is exhausted by the endless wars, and how do we sort of be more efficient and limited in our overseas military commitments. How do you factor that in? That even if the countries in the region may be disappointed that they think they're second-class citizens compared to treaty allies, is that likely to change? I mean, is the US likely to say, oh, we need more allies, more formal, legally binding treaties? I don't know if you would agree, but I don't see the domestic politics or the politics in the US Congress as suggesting that there'll be a lot of enthusiasm for that.
No, that's absolutely fair. I mean, I think the one area where they might have a little bit more possibility is anything related to China, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
Where the Republicans kind of going in a much more anti-China direction, that kind of secures to some extent. It's both an opportunity and a weakness to some extent, right? Like any move that like kind of any more conciliatory move towards China that that Biden makes, for example, will be jumped on by, say, the GOP, like kind of the right-wing hawks. But any more hawkish moves, I think, will be welcomed by those same exact people. So there might be, can you get, is it 60 votes or 66 votes for a treaty? Or is it just 50? I don't remember. Either way, you might be able to get something along those lines, maybe particularly over Taiwan, because I feel like Taiwan's standing within Congress has never been higher, especially in relation to kind of the perceptions of a China threat. I mean, I will also say that the US has never really wanted to extend alliances. Even after World War II, NATO was supposed to be established as this really iconic political agreement only. It wasn't really meant to be a fairly heavily institutionalized formal alliance. Yes, it was ratified. Yes, it was written down, but I think it was Dulles who said something like, don't worry so much about the form, just the fact that we have a political commitment, we're good. That's all you really need to worry about. And of course, the European allies were like, nope, that is not good enough. And then two, because it went against what the US had already said beforehand. And I think two, the Korean War very much emphasized like, no, we're going to need a lot more coordination here. I would hope that it doesn't require a war for the United States to get serious about alliances. If we think that alliances are a good plan, and if we think that the Senate will approve it, I would hope that it doesn't take a war for it to be kind of taken seriously. That you would have the foresight to understand like that this is an issue that you want to get coordination on now, as opposed to after the guns have started firing. Asking for foresight from Congress, I think, especially in an era of the kind of imperial presidency, it's really hard. It's a big ask. But maybe at least in the case of Taiwan, you might be able to get something. Less so in the case of, well, certainly not Vietnam or Malaysia, but you might be able to dust off the U.S.-Philippines alliance and kind of reinvigorate it, especially if Duterte doesn't win another round of elections, that kind of thing.
Interesting. So there's one question, if we go back to the China side of the ledger, that I think is quite interesting. With the Chinese emphasis on face and the belief, their confidence that they will be setting the global agenda in the future, how confident could we be that they would sort of accept any agreement, stick by the terms of any kind of bilateral agreement they worked out with us? Would they feel that they have enough clout to only implement some bilateral agreement with us when it suits them? Would they feel less sort of subordinate to American power than I think we've assumed in the past? I'm extrapolating a little bit, but this issue of whether the Chinese their confidence level is going to exceed this carefully constructed mix of competition and cooperation that American administrations are always trying to define. Would the Chinese feel that they're not bound by such assumptions in the relationship?
Todd, thank you for the question. It's good to see you on here. It's a good question. I think ultimately, international politics, there are no guarantees. We live in a system of anarchy, by which I mean that there's no overarching authority that can enforce contracts. At the same time, though, I think going back to some of the policy recommendations on the gray zone, as well as just more generally, the issue is not so much can we get a guarantee, but can we get enough punishment for the failure to follow through on a commitment? And in that case, I think you absolutely can. That's where things like, what's kind of defunct now, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership, greater military cooperation, to some extent, there is a door open for China in, say, my extended deterrence strategy. If they're willing to abide by all these things, then maybe they can join. It's doubtful they would anyway, but maybe they can join. But if they were to do so, you have to, if they were to subsequently violate that agreement, then it has to be every other state kind of coming down on them like a ton of bricks. And I think one of the other policy courses of action that I provide in the book is a more accommodationist strategy, where the US and China I think what's the Chinese term? A new type of great power politics. Essentially, great power condominium between China and the United States, and you sell out all the other states. The difficulty with that course of action is exactly the one that you've identified. Once you give China what it wants, you're hoping that it becomes a satisfied power. But what if they aren't? What if they've already been secretly an unsatisfied power and they're just fundamentally revisionist? I don't know how, kind of getting to a genetic fallacy here, but they're just fundamentally revisionist. Or let's say they have time inconsistent preferences. You give them what they want and they say like, oh, this is kind of great. Maybe we were fully satisfied, but now we kind of want to go further. And so I think there are a lot of risks there. And so for me, at least, it's about getting that coalition together, getting that coordination down. And so then you can come with that united front and say, look, it's in your interest to do this. It's in your interest to cooperate. That's the carrot. If you don't, here is the punishment, here is the stick. And those sticks can range from military force, but even softer things like locking you out of certain trade agreements, or having less information about military moves in your own region will be kind of costly to the Chinese.
All right, let me try to combine I think the only questions that I've missed so far, they're not completely connected, but let me try. So I want to give you an opportunity to acknowledge any parts of Trump's kind of coercive strategy to China that you think were good and are worth retaining. Because really they did, I think it was under the Trump administration that the baseline for American views of China shifted. And that wasn't a purely partisan thing, in my view. And then there is a question about whether these gray zone activities, how they fit into the controversies about China's technology firms and its, investment in global infrastructure, global IT infrastructure. Are those two worlds going to collide at some point? So our strategy in restricting China's IT, how will that in any way affect how we think about its gray zone strategy? So those, I think, are going to be the last two points that we ask Raymond to comment on.
Okay, sure. In terms of things that I fully agree with you, Ellen, that the perspective on China has shifted dramatically under Trump, and I think he was largely responsible for that. Or, there's combinations of domestic American political institutions that might have kind of pushed that forward, but he was certainly a big factor. I did an interview with Ernie Anastas, who was the anchor for Fox New York, like their kind of local affiliate station. And so, he's a media personality to some extent in New York. He knew Trump way back when because they kind of walked in the same circles. And so in the sort of green room discussion we were having, he was just saying like, yeah, if the man would just get out of his own way, if he would just shut up, he would actually be able to be far more effective. And I think that's my main criticism of Trump's policy, is that I think he actually, did a good job in thinking about, or kind of framing China as a threat. I think he went too far, but I think the fundamental idea of competition with China was long overdue. Where he kind of messed up, it was in getting to kind of the racial stuff. Well, yeah, getting into the racial stuff, going too far with the nationalism, the kind of violent nationalism to some extent, and personalizing politics, and diplomacy, forgetting that it's not just you, it's the entire United States that has an interest in this. And we also have allies who have an interest in this position as well. And if you can't do the implementation right, if you can't get the execution right, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. So while he may have good intentions, ultimately he just couldn't get out of his own way. And that was a real problem. You can imagine a counterfactual world where Trump was able to actually lead and not have a sort of, I don't want to say like a tantrum or something like that, but just like an expression of emotion, like kind of a gut reaction. But instead of actually having leadership to bring together both domestic coalitions as well as international coalitions into like a coherent set of kind of states and actors working towards Chinese competition with China. I'm hoping Biden will do the same exact thing now, but Trump just didn't have the chops to actually implement it. And so that's where I think is, there's some positives, but a lot of negatives on that. IT infrastructure, technology firms. So I don't know if I necessarily think that gray zone strategies, or at least the way I define them, are necessarily related to these sort of IT cybersecurity issues. What I will say is that the solutions are connected. I was talking with a U.S. diplomat in the U.S. embassy to China a few years back, and we were talking about how China is trying to create essentially its own internet system, its own sort of IT system, and whether or not that would be successful. And generally speaking, our conclusion was like, yeah, they're not going to be successful, because ultimately, to have effective IT, to have effective, like, leading global companies in the sort of IT space, you need volume and size and data. There's a reason why Google and Facebook and Netflix are the biggest in their fields, is because they dominate the market. They take advantage of open protocols and consistent standards in the US, Europe, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, all the countries except for China essentially use this, to the point where Russia has problems trying to keep all this stuff out because they're kind of on that open standard as well, sort of. China, on the other hand, has has a really big internet market, but it pales in comparison to what's outside of it. And so when I think about technology competition and sort of IT infrastructure, my ultimate kind of conclusion is that yes, China is able to kind of use its sort of fiscal policy, industrial policy to pick winners and losers. Ultimately, those guys will lose because they just don't have the volume and scale that Google does. Compare Google and Baidu, you always go Google. There's just, you don't use Baidu because it's a terrible search engine. It just doesn't have the volume of data to get those really efficient algorithms.
Raymond, I can't thank you enough. We really put you through your paces. You had to cover a lot of ground here, but I think it was really terrific. And thanks so much to Mike Hunsiger and Mary Curtin for really getting the conversation going. We have run out of time. I want to thank everybody. We will, I believe, post this on the CSPS website, and maybe the Humphrey School will be able to do it as well. And we look forward to future conversations. These issues are not going away, so we will probably want to come back and revisit them fairly soon. Mary, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Ellen, and
Yeah.
thank you for for bringing this opportunity to us. We look forward to hopefully future opportunities like this about some of the monographs that you're publishing, and hopefully one day maybe another visit to the Humphrey School. Ellen was at the Humphrey School a few years ago, so thank you so much to all of you. This is a great conversation. I look forward to more.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.